In this video, we're going to be running through a fun little activity that's going to get you started with finding out what your true values are in life. So then we can use those as frameworks to build onto your life purpose. And this is the third part of this whole life purpose series. So if you're new here, I would highly suggest you to go back to part 1 and part 2, where we unpack what life purpose actually means for us teenagers, and also why our values are so important in the process of aligning with our life purpose. Alright, so let's jump straight into this simple activity. And what we're going to do, if you haven't guessed it, is we're going to help you answer the question that's on the title of this video. And I'm going to be guiding you step by step with it, so you don't have to worry. So the question of the video is, what is the most meaningful thing to me in life? And I want to repeat it again. What is the most meaningful thing to me in life? So when you listen to this question, start off by putting your thinking cap on, turning on your brainstorming mode, and really think about it for a second. Think about what meaningful actually means to you. What do you find meaning in your life? When I first started really seriously thinking about this question and blocking out some time and contemplating what meaningful means to me, I remember it took me quite a while to get started because it's such a broad question, right? So let me actually give you some tools and processes that you can use to help you start generating ideas to these questions. So to begin with this question, just start off by brainstorming any ideas that you have that comes up in your mind right now. So for example, if whatever comes up to you, for example, if swimming comes up to you as something meaningful, just write that down. Just whatever feels like gut feeling to you, just note that down, as it might probably mean something to you. And some other more practical ways that is really useful is I like looking back into my photo album and videos, right? Because that's a pretty useful tool to look at, what you've been spending a lot of your life on. Maybe in the weekends you've been hanging out with your friends. Maybe friends is one of your values that you find most meaningful. Or maybe you're someone who's completely the opposite, where you like to read books and you like to, highlight different words on your Kindle and things like that. So just look at these databases and see whether or not there's anything that reminds you of some kind of memory, right? And even though you may not take so many photos, it might spark something else when you look back at these photos. So it's definitely a pretty good idea to look back into your photo album and see whether or not there's any clues there with what you actually find meaningful in your life. And another very useful technique and super useful way, which I found, is really just looking at your social media story history. And many people out there, they talk about how social media is so negative and really doesn't help us, and we're always doom scrolling. But then on the other hand, I like to look at this in a positive lens, because if you think about it, social media can actually show you what type of things you're attracted to, right? For example, if my reels are filled with people making prank videos or people traveling around the world, then that might be a sign to me that being adventurous or traveling might be one of my top values that I find meaningful, right? So rather than shaming yourself by looking at these videos, we can be more aware that these things exist as valuable things and important things to us, so that we can note them down and really recreate these moments in our lives to give us more purpose and fulfillment. And another really useful strategy is journaling. And right here, what I actually have is I have a copy of a paper journal, which I first started writing back in, if you can see here, I zoom in a bit, back in June 3rd, 2023. So it's been basically nearly, I'll say 2.5 years since I first started journaling on paper. And actually before that, funny story was, I used to always keep this travel journal where I would write down, when I was 8 years old, I would write down everywhere where I traveled and stick, stickers and all of these collectibles that we had along, the leaflets and, tourists, souvenirs and things like that, which was pretty funny. And then afterwards, I just started journaling, right? I just started writing things down on what I like to do every single day, and just my feelings and things like that. So looking back at your journal can be a really effective way if you're trying to figure out what is meaningful to you, because you might be able to find some patterns. Because, for example, when I sometimes read back at my journal, I start to realize how, number one, I'm super consistent with my journaling. So probably discipline and self-regulation is one of my values and one of the things that I find most meaningful. And in general, I remember I used to journal like 2 hours every single time. Like time would pass by and fly by without me even noticing it. And normally my parents would force me to go to bed because I've been staying up late after like a long day trying to journal everything. So I find writing to be another meaningful method for me to express myself. So probably writing and doing something related to that in my future career, or something related to my life purpose would be relevant to me. So yeah, just really nice looking back at these journal entries, right? And another way to look back at how much you've grown and what you've been interested in is looking at your chat messages. And I think this is really an underrated method to find out and be more self-aware of what you like to talk about. But most people, they will disregard like older chat message history unless you're trying to find something. But then if you think about it, if you just look through your Instagram DMs or your WhatsApp chat messages or your Discord messages or whatever platform that you use, most of the time what you'll see is that you're involved in these different community or different groups. And normally these groups represent a specific thing that is meaningful to you, which makes you spend time in, right? And really the question is, what do you like spending most of your time in? What brings you the deepest joy? Really, there's really no different to answering those two questions with the question on being meaningful. So just look back into chat history and you might be able to see some photos or some messages or some different topics that you like to chat about when you're young, which may spark some interesting ideas on what you actually find most meaningful with in life. Finally, another very nuanced strategy that not many people talk about is you can actually visit old spots that would bring you memories and childhood nostalgia. And, to some people this might seem crazy or it might spark some really strong emotions, but then once you actually revisit these spots, for example, like your old school, like if you go back to kindergarten, right, the place where you went to school every day with your parents, or primary school, right, or wherever you can access, like for example, I used to always go to like a restaurant when I was a kid because my parents really loved that restaurant and they would bring me every single Saturday and Sunday to eat there. Right, so most of my childhood was developed there, where I would play video games and try this food, try that food, hang out with my friends. It all happened in that area, right? So by going back and revisiting that location, it might again spark some memory or some kind of idea on what you actually enjoy doing, because we're trying to get that inner child inside of you out, right? We're trying to understand what actually intrinsically motivates you rather than doing something that you're externally motivated with and that's not authentically aligned to you. So one of the really good ways is just going back to places where you've frequently visited and seeing what memories it can bring you. And really, at the end of the day, it's really about what you can do to spark back your past memories. So whatever you find most useful, maybe it's some kind of routine that you used to do, or it's some kind of book that you used to read, right? Whatever you can do to spark back this past memory and bring you those moments of joys, that will help you find out what is most meaningful to you and brings you the most joy in life, especially when you're stuck right now with debating whether or not this is something that was conditioned into me but not authentically me, or whether or not that is actually something that others find happiness in but not for myself. And one thing that you might realize when you spend some time looking back into the past and figuring out what you find most meaningful is that you might get drowned into these memories or videos. And what do I mean by getting drowned? I mean, once you get absorbed into these videos, then you would just constantly get into the loop of looking back into this memory and then that memory, and then you just keep going on and on and on, and then you realize that hours have passed, and then you're like, oh my days, what am I doing with this, right? When initially the activity was to be more aware. So what you want to do with that and not really fall into this loophole is just accepting that it's just going to be part of the process, and then also noting it down frequently that this is one of your values. So what I like to do before, when I was doing this exercise and trying to figure out what my top values are, is setting a 10-minute timer every single time to remind me to write things down. So after the 10 minutes are over, then I will force myself to put away that piece of memory that I was investigating in, no matter if it's like watching a video, just pausing the video, or if I'm looking and scrolling through social media or my photos, just putting your phone away and then telling yourself consciously that you're going to write whatever you were looking at down in some kind of notepad or like a piece of sticky note or whatever you're trying to use to, figure out what is most meaningful to you. And this way, over time, like you won't really get stuck in these loop of like hours passing by and you're not really jotting anything down and getting stuck in your childhood without making any progress. And side note is that normally if you do get stuck in one of these like loops of childhood memory, it normally indicates something deeper. It's like either this is a validation of one of the values that you have, or it's some kind of childhood memory that stuck with you a lot. Maybe there's some kind of traumatic experience, or there's some kind of strong emotion that is either positive or negative, which is stuck with you. So then it's always good to just accept that you were longing this memory and just write this down, because it might play a significant role when you want to decondition or when you want to amplify these values in the near future. So before you get into this exercise yourself, here are some other things that you will want to do when answering these questions to ensure that we're successful with getting the answers that we want to get. So the first thing is to ensure that you are as clear and as specific as possible with all of your answers. So this means that you shouldn't just write down some general cliche activity. For example, maybe something that I find meaningful is saving the world, or I find life to be meaningful when I watch TV. Right? These things are good to note down, but then what you would want to do is to be more specific. So what specifically would you want to do which you categorize as saving the world, right? Maybe you want to save, humanity, or do you want to save the environment, or do you want to save animals, right? Because these can be all different categories. So what you want to do is be as specific and even go deeper, right? Which group in humanity do you want to save? And, like when do you want to save them, or what do you want to do to save them, right? And one of the big things that you can do is answer the 5 W's. So just write down the 5 W questions: who, what, where, when, why, right? Even though these things are things that we're taught in kindergarten, but it can be super helpful for us to use these tools to figure out what specifically we actually want to do in our lives. And another way to dive into the specifics, especially when you don't really have like a good idea, maybe it's something that you haven't thought about for quite a while, is to just visualize it in your mind. So start immersing yourself into that experience. So for example, if you haven't watched TV for quite a while for some reason because you've been busy with schoolwork, but then you find watching TV as something that's joyful, right? Just close your eyes for a minute and just put yourself into that position where you were watching TV and you felt the most joy. Like which exact moment in like a particular TV series or, whatever or whenever did you feel the most joy and the most spike in like your dopamine, and you feel like you're in the top of the world and all the happiness is coming to you. And maybe you think back to the moment in the TV show where the character suddenly has like a plot twist and you're fighting this whole hero scene. So I'm thinking about like the Avengers Endgame scene, right? That moment really stuck with me, especially when Captain America he heard the call from Black Panther that there was going to be rescue over there, right? Like during that moment, my heart was beating super fast, and that moment just felt like, yes, I'm part of this team, I'm part of this group, right? It feels like I'm actually in the movie fighting, even though I'm just the audience watching. So maybe that moment is significant to you for some reason. Maybe it's because you valued, this whole sense of teamwork and fighting for a particular mission. And just knowing that itself can be super helpful, because if you think about it, then it might hint that your life purpose has to do something with collaborating with others and fighting for like a bigger mission, right? And maybe collaboration is going to be key in your life purpose rather than doing something in solidarity or doing something alone. So just think about what exactly in that moment makes you feel fulfilled. Because normally what you might find is you might write something down, but then it's not actually that moment that makes you feel fulfilled, but it's something else. So then that can help you clarify what actually brings meaning in your life. And another thing that I found super helpful when I answered this question is really just blocking out a chunk of time during the day and just thinking about it without any distractions. And if you don't have much time, you can think about doing this consistently for 20 minutes every single day and then doing it more during the weekend. But then what it actually helped me do is just quiet my mind down, because most of the time when you're multitasking, and we're in an age where everyone loves to multitask because we have too many things to do, most of the time we generate shallow answers. And these answers are just things that we encounter every single day, and it just suddenly pops up in our conscious mind, when in reality these are actually not the deep answers that we're looking for. So if you really want to figure out what brings the most meaning to you in life and really understand yourself more, it's very important to really block out this time and understand the importance of this activity, right? Why is this important? If you think about it for a second, why is it important to figure out what is most meaningful to you? Because only after we figure out what is most meaningful to you can you then build a life purpose and figure out what you want to actually do in life that actually aligns with you and that actually brings you joy. Because most people, what they do on a daily basis is that they just run their daily life with mundane activities and follow the herd and follow the sheep, follow the crowd. And the problem with that is that most likely that does not align with what brings you the most joy, right? It doesn't align with what makes you unique and what makes you feel deeply fulfilled. So then what we have to do is really just sit down ourselves, right? Sit down in solitude and figure out what this person is on the inside and what this person needs in order to be able to serve yourself. And only after you serve yourself are you going to be able to serve others effectively. Because if you think about it, if you're going to do something that does not 100% align with the unique mechanism that you are yourself, and that actually gives you deep joy, how are you going to be able to give 200% effort to whatever you're committing in serving others or serving whatever, right? How are you going to do that without being aligned with yourself in the first place and actually loving yourself for doing the things that you're doing? Because you can see how emotions play such a huge role in motivating you to do the things that you are doing every single day. And without the right emotions, you won't have the willpower to do the things that you want to do. So then what's the point of doing something in a petty way? How are you going to build something bigger if in the beginning you don't have the intrinsic motivation to guide you, to push you through, especially those challenging times, right? So make sure to take this exercise seriously, because a lot of people and most viewers, what they're going to do is they're just going to treat this as another video to mentally masturbate with, and to just take it as like a casual joke, as like another tool to investigate one day later, but not now. And what ends up happening is that life flies by so quickly. Like sometimes it's crazy to see how time flies by so quickly, right? Like I'm going to be graduating high school in like, 3 months, 4 months? And I'm going to be out there in the real world. And I've been so grateful to myself for discovering that these values and these concepts actually exists, so then we can actually align ourselves to do something that matches our life purpose, to do something that feels natural to us, rather than following things that other people are saying. So I hope you can take this exercise seriously, because when you do take this exercise seriously, and I know this directly from firsthand, you'll find huge benefits with all of the answers that you generate, and you're really doing your future self a great deed. All right, so once you have this list of activities, what you'll want to do next is you will want to start making connections and identifying any patterns that you see with all of these activities. So a question that I really like to ask when I look back through my answers, let's just say I have like 10 to 15 bullet points, or you might have more, right? Is what do these activities have in common? And most of the time, what you'll see is that maybe this activity and this activity goes together and they reinforce like a similar meaning to you or similar feeling, right? And really what you want to do is test for feeling rather than following your logic a lot. Because most of the time you would intuitively know like that feeling is right, or maybe that feeling is not that right, or it's like not that thing, but it's this thing that makes you feel fulfilled, right? So what you want to do is, even though sometimes you might not be able to describe it, just try it and generally get a feeling for what it is that actually gives you that spark, gives you that joy. So just want to give you now some personal examples to show you on like some of the answers that I generated. And by no means do I want you guys to be copying me, and by no means do I want to bias your answers, but just to give you guys like some ideas on what I wrote and how I'm making these connections. I'm just gonna read out. So here are some of the sticky notes that I first wrote when I'm doing this exercise. And just going down the list, I think I listed around 15 items here. So in bullet points, my first one was identifying problems and thinking of solutions, and the sound of nature, having a solid vision and mission to work on. And that one, I would say, when I look back, is something that I would remove, because in general, like what the question is asking is what is most meaningful to me, and we already imply that you want to be working on a bigger mission and a bigger vision. So if you see some of these answers that are kind of broad and that kind of just re-allude to the question, then you can just disregard them, but it's still good to note them down, like especially when you're in the brainstorming phase, right? And being the unique one in a scenario, one-on-one conversations on helping others' lives. And this one, actually, I actually have encountered multiple times in my life where like I would find deep joy whenever I spoke with someone else and helped them with a particular area in life. And if you're friends with me, or if you speak to some of my friends, they'll probably think that I'm a pretty contemplative person, especially when I'm super into this whole psychology and finding life purpose work. And it really brings me great joy whenever I help them figure out what their life purpose may be, or teach them some kind of new concept. And that's just something that I noted down. Another one is having independence and freedom. And I think that was one of the big things that I used to pursue a lot, especially with my agency and running all of these different projects on the side. Was I really wanted to do something on my own. I really wanted to have more control with what I was going to build and what I was going to explore, rather than following someone else's footstep and living like a mundane life, right? So then that was one of the things that are most meaningful to me. And then another one is documenting and writing about my life. And I think that's one of the most obvious ones, especially when one of the things that I do weekly is I like to journal a lot. And now I actually don't journal on like a paper journal, but I like to do it digitally, as I find it more easier when I want to search up some keywords, or when I want to look back at something. It's way easier, especially when you're going on travel trips, right? You don't want to be just carrying all of these heavy layers of books when you can just have it on like your phone or your computer. And then another one is singing in church / football songs, being united. So one of the things that I was really aware of was whenever I went to church, I'm a Catholic. I used to go to like a Catholic primary school when I was young. I will feel this sense of joy inside of me for some reason. And it's like shivers and goosebumps will come out my skin whenever we sang like those weekly hymns together. And I remember like it felt like I was in heaven and everything was just coming together. And this made me realize that I had a similar feeling when I was also watching football games. And I haven't actually watched a lot of football live games, but when I was watching my favorite club, Liverpool, back during the summer, I think like two years ago, we were singing like the Liverpool anthem, and everyone around me was singing it as well. And just something within that moment of singing just made me feel so emotional to the point where I started like having tears roll down. And I think I have a video of that as well, which I can play on the screen. But there was just something about being united and being around a whole group of people and like chanting and singing towards like a common purpose and like this feeling of unity, which makes me feel deeply fulfilled and super meaningful to me. So that's an interesting thing to note down, right? Another thing that I wrote down was mixing existing things together and finding unique things between them and finding commonalities, basically. This is actually such a funny one because I realized that as a person, I'm actually pretty weird. Like, I call myself a pretty weird person because sometimes, like, my mind would just randomly look at things on the street and just make random connections between things. Like, it's kind of crazy. Like, even though if it's a small little thing like a texture on the wall or if it's just like a car plate, my mind will just somehow logically, or maybe not logically at times, but somehow try to connect these things together and find some interesting patterns and just make sense of it to be some kind of insight on the things that I'm working on or whatever I was thinking about, which is just something interesting to note. And another one is structurally how to organize things to convey an experience. Yeah, that was one of the big ones which I found super meaningful, which is just analyzing the structures of things. So one of the things that I like to do on the side is really look at different YouTube videos and analyze like the different structures on how it's effectively communicating. And for some reason, those colors and those like analysis just makes me feel super satisfied. And I guess this is one of the main reasons why in school I decided to take English at the higher level and also film, because these subjects allow me to look at different literary texts and different like ways of communication and just analyzing how effective the structures are. And that just gives me a lot of meaning and makes me feel like empowered when I like overlook all of these different types of mediums, right? And some smaller bullet points that I had was user experience. And I think the reason why I wrote user experience is because I really like looking at these websites, like, those websites where there's like some fancy animations and some really nice colors. I think those just spark some kind of inner joy inside of me. And then there's also like colors and visuals, which I noted here. And the sounds of nature, that's another one. I really love hiking. And for some reason, it just gives me a lot of joy. And sometimes, like with these answers that you have, like it doesn't have to be logical. You don't have to reason them. And for some of them, you could see before, which I've explained, I am able to reason them and find out why I'm actually liking that thing. But then for other things, you don't have to reason them. You can just describe them as detailed as possible, as long as it is accurate to what you find most meaningful too. And I think that's one of the things that most people disregard, is that we try to logically pinpoint exactly why we do the things that we do, but then sometimes things just come naturally to us. And it's really part of accepting on who we are as a human being. And there are things that just comes naturally to us and we don't have to explain it, right? And that's the beauty of living an aligned life, is that once you find these things, then you can easily amplify them and maximize your potential in life. All right, so after you find some of these connections, what you will want to do is deeply think about the meaning of these values. So, for example, if you're able to identify some commonality between these different activities, for example, maybe justice is one of my values, then you want to ask the question, what does justice actually mean to you? And if another value that you have is, let's say, intimacy, right? What does intimacy mean to you? Because one of the big things that you'll find is that there are so many different ways of intimacy, right? There's physical intimacy, emotional intimacy, and like all these different sorts of intimacy. So you want to figure out what exactly with that value do you find most aligned with. Finally, I just want to end this video with another tool which popped up, which I found super helpful. So then I can give you like a range of tools, which is actually using AI to help you figure out what is meaningful to you. Because most of the time, what you'll realize is that there might be some things which is hard for you to articulate for some particular reason. And what you can do is just play around with AI, right? And one of the AI that I really love using for this exercise and just in general for writing purposes is Quen. And another good one is also Claude. And what you can do is input like a prompt saying like, I have this thing that feels super meaningful to me, and I have this other activity that is meaningful to me. Could you find some connections between these two activities, which may be values of my life? And then you can just play around with the prompt and just send up follow-ups and just take a look and read some different ideas, right? Because again, like what we want to do is spark these ideas so then we can unlock all of these things that have been hidden inside of you this entire time. And in order to do that, we need to hit it in multiple different angles, right? Use as many tools as possible so that we can get the maximum range of ideas for you to answer this question. So that's it for this video. Hopefully you found it pretty useful, as I think this exercise really gave me a click on really finding the different angles or the different potential paths that I can take when I'm considering my future life and even doing things in the present, such as how I'm going to be approaching this task in school or how I'm going to be approaching this project, right? And really implementing these things that you find meaningful as much as possible in your life, so then we can start being more fulfilled and happy beings rather than being so negative and drowned in all of this mental woo-woo that's clogging our brain. So yeah, can't wait to share more of these tools in the future, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace out.